Welcome to the Jacob's Porch podcast. My name is Grant Eckhart, and I serve as pastor here of this college ministry located at The Ohio State University. And today I'm pleased to have with us Dr. Ryan Burge, who's a sociologist teaching at Eastern Illinois University, also an American Baptist pastor, which makes for a really great combination of backgrounds when doing religious landscape, Twitter, and surveys. So we're so glad you're on. Today we're talking about your newest book, second edition of your book, The Nuns, where they came from, who they are, and where they are going. The book starts off with a great story of you looking at some 2018 religious landscape survey data. You send off a quick tweet, put your kids into the bath, and then once you're done, you start seeing your Twitter feed blow up. So I want to hear about that that tweet that you put out and why that was such a big deal and got you in the New York Times and all kinds of interviews and whatnot. And then also, because we are a Lutheran campus ministry, curious how you got involved with Fortess Press, which is our publishing house within the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America.
Well, Grant, I don't know. Tweets are tweets, man. I mean, it's. I think that I listened to a podcast one time, and this guy, he was a TikToker. He got famous on TikTok, and someone asked him like, what have you learned about being on TikTok that other people don't know? And he goes, listen, most of your content doesn't do anything, and no one remembers it, and that's great. So the people only remember the things that you do that did well. So don't be afraid to put out lots and lots of things. And if it doesn't land, it's not like you spent money on that. You might spend a little time on making a graph. In my case, I'm not spending any money on that. So if you keep putting out content, you never know what's going to, catch and take off. And so really what that means is you got to just crank out content. It's just a numbers game. Like that's how people how do you go viral? I don't know, but the best thing I can do is you got to keep working, like just keep putting out content, and you never know what will take off. And that tweet, when I was tweeting at that point, I had, I don't know, like 500 Twitter followers. I was a very small account, just posting graphs about religion, once or twice a day. And if I got 5 retweets, I was like, yay, it's a great, I'm doing great. And then that new data came out, and I tweeted that graph, which I'm looking back on, it's not a great graph, like aesthetically, but it had that clarity that you need to get that going, right? Like it just, that's the thing about Twitter. You got to have 1 point. You can't have 4 points. There can be no nuance. It just has to be 1 point. And the point was the nuns now are larger than evangelicals or Catholics. They're the largest religious group in America. And man, it just took off like wildfire. And in my career now, I can trace, that's my creation moment. I can trace everything I have now. You got to get, people ask me, how do you get a platform? And the hardest part is getting that first rung of the ladder, right? Mm-hmm. Moving up one step. And that was my one step. It got me into that next sphere. And then that got me talking to the Times and the Post and the Times of London and you name it. And everyone wanted to talk about this issue. And so that kind of built my platform, that first rung of the ladder, and then everything there is really kind of a consequence of that moment because people want to know about religion. They just do. Even if they're not religious, they still care about it in some ways. I think it's one of those topics where I tell people, I'm glad I'm not an astronomer because I don't have to convince you what I do is important or relevant. I walk in a room and say, I do religion and politics, and people are automatically interested in what we're talking about. And so that's I just feed that content machine. And kind of put more data and more graphs out there, try to be objective and neutral, try to look at both sides, try to be a truth teller as best I can, try to keep my opinion out of it as much as I can, and just let the data speak for itself. And that's sort of, that led, okay, second part of the question, how did I get to Fortress?
Right.
Happenstance is the answer. They actually came to me.
Okay.
I didn't go to them. Beth Gady was one of their editors at the time. She's now retired. Beth emailed me a query letter basically saying, you got any ideas for a book? We're looking for books in this series. Can you pitch a proposal? And I kind of honestly looked at the email and go, nope, don't want to do that. Because you think about what I do. I write tweets, 140 characters. Well, at the time it was 140 characters in one graph. That was my life. was all these little, like, I mean, micro bite-sized pieces of things, and a book is like a big thing. So eventually I kind of wrote up a proposal in about an hour. I emailed it to Beth, and then they took it, and I wrote the book, and the book did well. I mean, it's not a blockbuster, New York Times bestseller, but for what it was and where it was in my career, it exceeded every expectation that Fortress had for me. And that continued my relationship with Fortress. So now I wrote a book called 20 Myths About Religion and Politics in America that came out last year. And then after that book came out, they approached me about writing an updated edition of the Nuns. And I wanted to do that because I thought there's new data out there. And, it's been 3 years, and I've learned a lot and thought a lot about the Nuns because I've had to talk about the Nuns for the last 3 years when the book came out. So, it's just kind of been one, it's a classic example of like one thing leads to another. And so that's how I got to where I got.
Right. I mean, it's, first of all, great when the Lutherans are the first to have somebody, before they're famous, write something that's, culturally significant. So yay for the Lutherans. But also, I think, first of all, the second edition, you've added a lot of material from the first edition of the book. And I wonder if your combination of being a pastor and a sociologist is helpful here, because you seem to have a lens that really speaks to at least my ear as a pastor. Back in 2018-19, somebody sent me that tweet. And I was like, wow, here is a tweet that's really clear. Just like you said, you had one point. And I've been tracking your stuff ever since. Now, I'm not on Twitter, which is probably awful for a campus pastor to say, but I'm glad you're on Substack now, where we can kind of follow that, your developments. But you've added quite a bit into this second edition because there's really more data over the last 3 years, and probably you've learned something over the last 3 years. Like how have you developed in the last 3 years into, what how what to put into these books and these posts, these graphs?
I mean, my biggest fight is what to not put in there, because I've got, honest to God, I could write a 400 or 500 page book about the Nuns. I mean, and I could probably knock that out in the next 6 months. And and a lot of it's already graphs I've already made. Like in my head, I've got kind of this Rolodex of this thing and that thing. And like a lot of my Substack is really just taking these like disparate graphs I've put out there. A lot of them didn't really do that well on Twitter, because I understand that they didn't do well because it's part of a larger like point I need to make. And so like I just had a post this morning about a question about why, if the Nuns are rising so rapidly, now they're like a third of the population, why are Democrats not just kicking butt on election day? Every day every election day in America, which is a great question. I have like 7 graphs in that post, which is probably too many, but it's a really complicated kind of answer. But you know what? For of those 7 graphs, I only had to make like 2 from scratch. Like 5 I already had versions of somewhere. I just kind of tweaked and changed and threw them together. So for me, it's an editing problem. Like how much content do I want to put in it? And with the Nuns, that has always for me seemed more like less academic and more poppy. So I don't want that to become like a 350, 400 page tome about the non-religious people. I think people get graph anxiety or graph fatigue over time. It's like too many graphs, too much to digest. And so that book now is 200 pages. If I do write a third edition, it might get to like 230, 250, but I don't ever want it to go above 250 because I want the average pastor who's not a social scientist, right, who doesn't deal with data and graphs every day, to be able to read that book in a couple short sessions and walk away with something valuable for them and not feel like they have to slog through 400, 500, 600 pages of information, which can get redundant. And I think what happens is the more you put in, your point gets muddier. Right, it doesn't get clear; it actually gets less clear because your mind, there's too much. You need to focus on the thing, and so I think that's what the Nuns has always been: is like just laser-like focus on this one thing, and everything else can go somewhere else.
Right, and that's, I mean, as somebody reading your book, I saw all the graphs at the beginning. I got a little intimidated, but it was like each next graph was so juicy and distinct. I thought that it kind of kept me going, and I want to get into some of the, for lack of a better phrase, mythbusters that I can't, you wrote the 20 myths. I haven't read that book yet, but it seems like maybe some of those things are in this book because I saw some things that dispelled myths that I have. But maybe to start just broadly for folks on that first tweet, what's the general religious landscape? You do some great trend work from the 70s to now based on general religion surveys. What's the outlook for like mainline Protestants, evangelicals, Catholics, and then these Nuns? How have things changed over the last 50 years?
Evangelicals are really, really interesting because they're it's like a whipsaw. Like they were lower. They were on 17% in 1972, and then they jumped all the way almost to 30% by 1993. They were 29 and some change in 1993. And today, they're about 21, 22%. So it's kind of like low, high, and then kind of sliding back down to where they were. But actually, one of the myths is like evangelicals are in decline. There's actually, 17 to 22 is up over the last 50 years. If I show that graph to people, right, it's like almost a Rorschach test. Like if you like evangelicals or not, based on how you read that graph. If you don't like them, you say, look, they're down. And they are from 1993. They're down from 30 to 22 or 21. But if you do, then they're up. The share of Americans today who are the number of Americans today who are evangelical is same today as it was 30 years ago. About 75 million people are evangelical. And the share of Americans who say they're born again has been consistent around 32, 33, 34% over the last 14 years. So, evangelicals I think they're steady. There's still a lot of white Christians in America. That's actually what the post on Substack was about today is, there's been a lot of writing about the decline of white Christianity. There's still a ton of white Christians in America, right, even today. So evangelicals are in kind of up and down. And actually, I think they're up a little bit. Catholics were really, really steady for a long time. 26% in 1972. They were 25% in 2010. So like a 1% drop in 35 years, which is pretty like amazing if you think about it, considering the nuns and everything else. And in the last couple of years, you've seen a little dip. I think Catholics are probably in the low 20s now, 21, 22, depending on what survey you look at. But there, the difference is the racial thing. The number of the share of Catholics who are white has dropped to about 2/3 now, when it was like 90+%. The other thing about Catholics is mass attendance has dropped dramatically. Over 50% of Catholics attended mass every Sunday in the 1970s, and today it's around 24% attend mass every Sunday. So, I mean, the top number looks good. The inside of that composition looks really bad from a religious devotion standpoint. And then the main line is down, 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 as you probably know. I've seen data from the 1950s, which I cannot confirm, which is why I haven't put in any books yet. I've seen other books cite this number, but I can't find the actual original site for it. They said that in the 1950s, half of Americans were mainline Protestant. The earliest data I have is 1972, and in 1975, 30% of Americans were mainline Protestant. That's higher than evangelicals have ever gotten, by the way. They never got to 30%. And today, the share of Americans who are mainline is about 10%. And I think it's very reasonable to think that number is going to be half that amount in 15 years. Just because of the average age of mainline Protestant Christianity is over 60 years old now. So, death is going to lay a toll on the mainline. The PCUSA, I wrote a post about them a couple weeks ago on my Substack. They were 3.1 million people in 1984. They're 1.1 million people today. They're probably going to be 0 people by 2050. So, I mean, the mainline is an absolute collapse, and really no coming back from that, I think. I think it's going to have to be remade into something else. And then the nuns, 5% in 1972, 7% by 1990. Today, the nuns are about 30% of the American population. Amongst Generation Z, they're over 45% of Generation Z, and growing in every possible way: age, gender, race, partisanship, you name it. There's nothing. There's no part of American society, no segment of American society that's not been impacted by the rise of the nuns. You don't get to be 30% of the population by only doing one thing. You got to pull from lots of buckets. And that's what the nuns have done, and thank God for that, because it's given me an entire writing career.
Well, let's jump into the nuns then. I think in the book, you do a great job of splitting out the nuns into 3 different groups. Maybe people just want to lump all the nuns into one group. You say, no, there's atheists, agnostics, and the unaffiliated. Tell us more about that and how each group is a little different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's actually, I think, from like an academic standpoint, the contribution the book makes is that, like, I know if it's helpful for pastors, like a lot of part of that book is really more helpful for pastors, and some of it's more helpful for academics, and that part is actually helpful for both. So in surveys for a long time, we just gave you one option for no religion. It was literally no religion. That's what you said you were. We didn't do a follow-up, right? So what kind of non-religious are you? It was just, that's it. Next question, go on to the next thing. So about 15 years ago, this survey started called the Cooperative Election Study that uses the Pew setup, which actually gives you 3 options for nuns: atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular. Those 3 different options. And so that allows us to look at the nuns with some nuance. I write in the book, it would be stupid for someone to say all Protestants are the same.
Right.
But for 50 years, you said all nuns are the same. That's dumb. Like, that's such an oversimplification of an incredibly diverse group of people. So atheists are about 6% of the population, very liberal politically, right? Very, vote for Democrats. 87% voted for Biden in 2020. They're almost as unified as Black Protestants are now when it comes to the ballot box. They've grown from about 3 or 4% to 6% over the last 14 years. So growth, but not like exponential, oh my gosh, growth. They are incredibly highly educated. They are incredibly wealthy. Their household income ranks at near the top. And they're incredibly politically engaged. They do things like, I wrote a post on my Substack about how no one engages in politics more than the average atheist does. Half of them gave money to a candidate or campaign in 2020. I mean, for white evangelicals, it was 26%. So it just shows you, like, they are at a whole different level when it comes to politicking. They also don't have many kids. An interesting fact about atheists: they do not get married typically at rates that mirror the general population. They do not have children. So that whole trope about atheists, childless, unmarried, a childless atheist, is actually true. And they do well financially. Agnostics are like, I call them atheist light. They're like 10% less atheist. So slightly less liberal, slightly less democratic. I think they were like 7 points less for Biden than atheists were. So, still like 70% for Biden, but not 78, 79%. So they tend to be a little less politically active, a little lower education-wise, a little lower income-wise. So just think of like the average atheist and make them 10% less of whatever they are, and that's really what an agnostic is. And then the most important group, I think, is that third group, which is the nothing in particular group.
Right.
If you put 5 nuns in a room, one's an atheist, one's agnostic, and 3 are nothing in particular. So most nuns are not atheists or agnostics. Most nuns are nothing in particular. And that group is growing. Like, that's the big difference is that group is atheist, agnostic growing a little bit, and the nothing in particular is growing just exponentially. And they are the opposite of atheist. Politically, they're sort of middle of the road. They vote for Democrats, but they say they're actually conservative, more-ish. But they have very low levels of education. Only 25% of them have a 4-year college degree. Very low levels of income. So here's a statistic that really kind of like crystallized in the second version. 1/3 of nothing in particulars make $50,000 a year or less and have a high school diploma or less. One third. That's the most of any religious group. So an atheist is like 12%. So like they're in a totally different world from a socioeconomic standpoint. They don't engage in society. That's the one thing I want to make really clear is they do not do things like put up political yard signs or attend political meetings or protests. They don't donate to candidates or campaigns. So we can basically infer from that they're just not politically engaged at nearly the level of the average American or the average atheist. I just think that they're anti-institutional, right? They do not, education did not work for them. They're the people who dropped out or tried and couldn't make it work. They're the people who are probably struggling to get a permanent, full-time steady job. They're the people who are not engaging in the political process and think politicians are corrupt and the system works against them. So I think they're very cynical people. And I think they're the kind of people in American society that I worry about both as a pastor and as a political scientist, that like they're the kind of people that democracy needs to be engaged with, and they're not engaging. And that makes you feel disaffected, left out, left behind, lost, like the system doesn't work for you. And I think that leads to all kinds of negative outcomes in terms of violence, in terms of drug use, in terms of abuse. I think that you're seeing a lot of that with that group. I don't worry about atheist agnostics that much from a social science perspective. They're doing well. Society's treated them well, educationally, income-wise, everything else. So they're not worrisome. It's the nothing in particular group that we need to spend a lot more time and thought about, both as pastors and as Americans. They're a group that we should be concerned with.
Yeah, I mean, I think you blew about 3 myths there. These non-affiliated, these no religion in particular folks, after reading your book, my heart kind of goes out to them it's easy to lump that group in with what atheists and agnostics that I know here on campus, but they are very, very different as you've described. And, you mentioned the education level. I talk to a lot of parents. Sometimes it's, if they go to college, they're going to lose their religion. Sometimes that happens, but you've dispelled that in the numbers that actually people who go to college are more likely, not a lot, but it doesn't trend. The more education you get, as was that Weber who said that, the more education you get, the less religious you're going to get. That's really not the case anymore. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, that's one of the people ask me what's the biggest myth about religion and politics, and that's the one right there is there's this, I don't know where, I do know where it comes from. It comes from Karl Marx. What a jerk. Karl Marx's whole thing is religion is the opiate of the masses. He says that in the Communist Manifesto, which he's actually making an argument that the elite use religion as a weapon to keep poor people poor and happy about their poverty. It's a class struggle argument. But the thing is, if you actually look at the data over the last 14 years, in every single survey year, the people who are the most likely to be non-religious are those with the least amount of education. And the people with the highest amount of education are the most likely to be religious. And in another survey, I have a survey that's 477,000 Americans, so there's 4,000 people with doctorates in it. The group that is the most likely to be attached to a religious tradition are those with a master's degree. So that kind of blows up that whole idea of and it goes up a little bit with doctoral degrees, but it's still 24%, which is actually the same as people with a 4-year college degree. The people who are least likely to be attached to religion are those with a high school education or less. And I think that really kind of subverts the narrative that's out there, which is that religion is for stupid people, ignorant people. It's hillbilly backwater. And I think what it says, here's a stat that I think that we need to think a lot more about. The person that's the most likely to go to church in America today, the weekly attendance where it's the highest, are people who have 4-year college degrees making between $60,000 and $100,000 a year as a household. So middle class college educated folks are the ones who are most likely to be in church right now. And I think that's because they understand the value of it, not just from a God perspective, a theological perspective, but also from a horizontal perspective. They understand the value of community, of having a social group, of having an opportunity and an outlet to do social things. They like that, and they want more of that. And I always think I think the ideal person's a college educated guy who becomes an insurance agent. If you want to sell insurance, the best way to do is become part of a church with a bunch of people because they need insurance. They're going to go, hey, Grant sells insurance and he goes to church. He's a good fellow. I want to do business with him, right? So church, and I think the problem is for people at the lower end, they don't have those ladders, those mechanisms to kind of build their way up out of their SES status problem. And they can't, get a better life out of that because they're cutting, and I don't want to blame anyone for their own poverty, but I think a lot of them are cutting their own bootstraps by not being part of these organizations. And church people love helping church people. And I think that's what a lot of people miss about religion. I think it's just about, gay people are going to hell and you're going to hell and you can't swear and you can't gamble and all these things. They forget the fact it's a social network of people who help you get through the worst moments of your life and you help them get through the worst moments of their life. And through that, somehow your life is better and their life is better.
Yeah, as pastors, maybe we want to focus too often on the horizontal dimension. There must be some theological thing that's making this exodus, or that it's only about church only offers something in that vertical dimension. But as a social scientist, you're pointing out the importance of that horizontal dimension, that these churches bring together rich and poor, people from different backgrounds, and that in society this is one of the great services the church provides. That is one of the few places that does that. And what we see with the unaffiliated is that they are the most disconnected from that group where they could find resources and social connection.
And I think that's actually, I toyed around writing a book called "You Should Go to Church and It Has Nothing to Do with Jesus." And just makes this argument that you got to think about the horizontal value of religion. and a lot more people would get a lot more benefit. And I think they would actually come to church if you talked more about the horizontal value of religion. And so people always ask me, like, well, when I do a lot of, these kind of things with pastors and stuff, I'm like, well, what do we do as a church to try to bring the nuns back? And I tell them, I think you need to figure out a way for your church to be more social, and not social with like an agenda, right? Not social with like, well, we're going to hand out tracts or have an evangelistic sermon or have praise and worship time. No, just have a barbecue, for God's sakes. And you know how long it lasts? How long it needs to last. If people want to hang around and talk for an hour afterwards, let them talk. Like, give them space. And lots of churches have lots of space they're not using to the full capacity of what it can be used for. So I don't know if you've ever been in a church service, or you get to church and you're sitting in the pew talking to someone and you're almost mad when the church service starts because you're having such a great conversation with the person, because it's getting in the way of the social thing. Like, create more time for the social thing. Like, give people an opportunity to hang out after and before, and on a Tuesday night have a dinner. Just create space for people. And I think people will realize, like, wow, religion's not that scary. It's actually just people like me who are just trying to get through life as best they can, and they happen to believe in this Jesus thing. And and most people, by the way, do believe in God. 85% of Americans still believe in God today. So they're still amenable to the idea of religion. It's just the other stuff they're scared of. So give them a whole bunch of bad reasons to come to church, like free food and backpack giveaways or whatever else. Give them those reasons. And if nothing comes of it, that's fine, but at least you tried. And you actually might make democracy better and your community better and your church better by doing that.
Yeah, it's not just about church growth numbers. It's about strengthening the fabric of society that is tearing, that having those people together in that social space is good for America, so to speak.
And, pastors need to hear that, though. I don't think they fully recognize the value that they're, and listen, I don't want to bag on pastors too much. I'm a pastor myself. I did not go to divinity school. I do not have a degree in theology. I took like 12 hours of Bible in undergrad, which makes me super dangerous when it comes to that stuff. But, there's this saying, if you have a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail.
Yeah.
And, if you went to divinity school, you spent 3 years building a really big hammer that you think everything's a theological problem. I think that divinity schools and theology schools should be hiring sociologists a lot more to talk about like the social world that we live in now and the social value of religion and how other religions interact in American society. I think pastors could probably learn as much from that as they would from the vertical stuff. And I think it actually would inspire them to continue to do their work. If you say what you're doing is not just good for God, it's good for democracy and society and your community, they'd go, oh, wait, this is a lot more important than I thought it was. And I think they need to hear that message sometimes.
It makes me think, I spent a lot of times in mainline Protestant circles, evangelical circles, all the different things. As a campus pastor, I'm out in lots of different places on Sunday mornings. And reading your book, I had this thought of, you go to, say, a Lutheran service, and there's important stuff that happens at the beginning of the service. Like, you've got your confession and forgiveness. You might have a baptism right from the beginning. Like, you got to be in there. When I'm in an evangelical space, there's like 10 minutes of announcements. There's like 3 or 4 songs, then like kind of a wrap up. And there's like a good 20, 30 minutes of ramp up before people come in. So when I'm in those spaces, people are talking. Some people go in, obviously, but you got a lot of people finishing up that conversation. Then the sermon kicks in. It's like, oh, maybe we should move inside. They're almost by liturgical design. Not saying that we need to change the liturgy for that fact, but there just seems to be that kind of ramp up space where people can connect. Maybe I have that second cup of coffee, and that is incredibly valuable to the church and to society.
And you made me think of something really important. All those churches that have the back-to-back services, them have 2 or 3 services on a Sunday morning. They actually might be kind of shooting themselves in the foot by doing that, because like by pushing people out of the work, saying like in 20 minutes we got to do another service. You're not giving people time. And I think a lot of those, I will bag on non-denoms a lot because I think they're doing a lot of things wrong.
Yeah,
that is one of them. They don't build strong ties. Non-denom members, they're the most volatile of all Protestant Christianity is non-denominational Protestants. They have the more people move in and the more people move out over a period of time than any other denomination. And I think largely that's because they don't build those deep ties. Like, you can go to a non-denom church every Sunday for 6 months and no one knows your name. It's just you pop in and pop out. And listen, my conception of religion is the opposite of that, right? It's to be known and to know. to
Right.
be part of something and to build community. And I think a lot of those churches are thinking, how can we get the most people in our building as quickly as possible and get them out as quickly as possible? And it's almost like you're cutting it at the root of what a church should be by doing that. And there's not an easy solution. If you got too many people and not a big enough building, you got to figure something out. But how about creating another space for those people to leave the worship space and go to a gym or a fellowship hall, someplace they can go hang out and talk, and there's coffee and donuts or snacks or whatever, and the kids can run around the gym and have a good time. And it gives you that space between services to kind of do what you want to do. I think churches need to be a lot more mindful about the before and the after and what that does for their community.
And even seeing that as a pastor is kind of a spiritually rich place. Here in our ministry, we have a meal beforehand, and we say, worship is beginning even now as you eat and talk, and we'll take our time. Now, we have the flexibility in a college ministry to do that, but seeing those coffee hours and that time before and after worship as an extension of the worship service, I think we don't conceive enough of how that's going to be a mental health investment, which is, I think, spiritually healthy for folks, to give them that connection, especially with what you're saying about the nuns, where they are so disconnected everywhere else. I was surprised in your book where you said I think I'm going to get this right, where it's now just slightly more women than men. I always put, men are the atheists, men are the agnostic. I don't know why I had this in my mind, but now it's turning a little bit where it's women, correct?
I think that's one of the biggest stories of the last year or two when it comes to religion and data is we've always known, I'll put known in quotes there, air quotes. We've always known that women are more religious than men. And the data sort of bore that out over the last 50 years. And not just in the United States, across the world. Women tend to go to services more often. They tend to have a more certain belief in God. They tend to be more likely to affiliate with a religious tradition. All the things, like, they are more religious. And then if you look at the last 5 or 6 years of survey data, if you look at the youngest adults, so people who are like 18 to 25, Gen Z basically, because we don't survey children. That's like super hard to do from an ethical standpoint. So it's only 18 and up. If you look at the youngest adults, the curve for the nuns for women has continued to rise, even amongst the youngest women. But for men, it's sort of flatlined. So like a 27-year-old man is just likely to be a nun as a 20-year-old man. So that means that women have risen past that flat line for men. It's at least, they're probably equal now if women are not more likely to be non-religious. And there's always been like a 3 or 4 point gap. And so that's a really interesting future for American Christianity, because if you look at a lot of older churches, it's a lot of widows. Their husbands have died and they still go to church because they like the community and the togetherness of that. And imagine, and my church would not exist if it were not for women. I mean, I'll just be point blank dead honest. On Sunday, we had 9, I think, in worship, and there were 2 men and 7 women. And that ratio is pretty typical. I think it's 75% female in my church. So imagine what this means. Extrapolate this out, right, for 40 or 50 years. And I think a lot of churches that could have held on if they had more women to carry the load of the church will not be able to carry on because they won't have leadership and organization and planning and all the things that it takes for a church to exist. So I think that's sort of like a major warning sign for religious decline accelerating in the future.
I think what makes that even more of an exclamation point is, you mentioned in the book how people without children are less likely to go to church than people with children, and how women are 3 times as likely to be the parent in a single parent family, and that's kind of kept women more connected to church because of resources. But now that that's closing, it makes me even more worried about that family dynamic and how that family can find the resources they need.
And I think that's to go back to that point. I mean, I think it's the people who are the most likely to go to church are the people who did everything right, quote unquote, in terms of they went to college, they got a good job, they got married, they had kids. They didn't get divorced. They didn't have a kid out of wedlock. They checked all the boxes of like the American dream, quote unquote. If you do anything that deviates from that path, the chance of you falling away from religion go up exponentially. So if you if you have a kid before wedlock, if you live with your partner before you get married, if you get divorced, if you don't graduate college. All those things are hugely impactful when it comes to American religion's become a place for people who did everything right. And increasingly, fewer and fewer people are doing everything right, quote unquote. They're not getting married. They're delaying marriage until they're 35 or 40. They're being intentionally child free.
Right.
That is not a space for religion is not a space where you're 35 years old, you've been married for 10 years and you've chosen not to have children. That is not going to be a welcoming space for you, because that is not the right, quote unquote, way to do life. And that's the problem is, and I don't think religion's doing this on purpose, by the way. Like, I don't think churches are like, if you had sex before you're married, you're out. Or if you had a child out of wedlock, you're out, or you got divorced, you're out. Actually, I think churches don't even talk about divorce anymore because so many people are divorced.
Right.
But I think subconsciously, people go, well, I messed up, so therefore religion's not for me. I don't know how to solve that problem, but I think that the churches need to understand that's still a thing that exists in society, and it's something they need to push back against, I think, in some way, saying, no, you're all welcome here, whether you did everything right, quote unquote, or wrong. We don't care. We'll take you as you are and accept you as you are.
And I think that message can't be said enough. Working before I was in college ministry, I was pastor of a large suburban church in Cincinnati, and we had ministry to Section 8 families. And, the ministry wasn't for them to come to church, but we offered it in case they were interested. And all of them said, we can't go to that church. There's nice cars in the parking lot. And it looks like people, and I was like, oh, wow. We want to go to church with folks that are going to be similar to us, and we got to find a way to break that down for the social cohesion. It was really just kind of embarrassing to hear that, they just, I'm not like you. I don't have the education level as you, so I can't go to your church. I was a suburban church, but we just can't go there. And on the flip side, how many people in church do we feel comfortable sharing our mistakes and where we're not perfect, so that people can sympathize and be like, okay, this place isn't actually that different than who I am.
But that thing is, how do you remake a space when, let's say your church is all, white, college educated folk? How do you remake a That's actually always been the strength, I think, of Protestant Christianity is it doesn't have to be all one thing. You've got churches that appeal to this mass and this mass. The Catholic Church, I think, is amazing because there's one of them. You got to appeal to everybody at one time. Protestants can make their own denominations or their own new churches. They're like, we're going to especially reach out to this kind of the people. I think that's an interesting push and pull, okay? Because I think one of the values of Protestant Christianity is it's been able to differentiate itself by creating a new congregation to meet this new need, which has been great. But the movement now in Protestant Christianity is actually the opposite of that. It's towards mergers and acquisitions. Right. I think the future of American religion is fewer churches, but bigger churches. The average size of a church, I think, is going to go up exponentially over the next 20 years. We're going to see, instead of having, let's say 10 churches of 400 people, you're going to have 4 churches with 1,000 people, because it just makes more sense from an economy of scale situation. You can have full-time pastors, you can have full-time groundskeepers, you can have full-time youth pastors and all, and gyms and trips and infrastructure. So I think that's actually going to make it harder to appeal to these kind of edge case people, these marginalized people. So I just think that in some ways the church is going in the direction that makes it harder to appeal to the kind of people who would need the church the most.
It's kind of a word to, make sure that those city, those first, those second ring churches close to the city, that we don't lose those, because those are the places where you find that mix that you're talking about. You can a little bit in the suburbs, but the closer you are in those rings, and even some rural churches, you get that as well. So, I think that's just so incredibly important. And also, one more note on the nuns generally, and I want to pivot to Gen Z specifically for college pastors. I was surprised, particularly with Black Protestants, how that's, I think, the fastest growing disaffection to the nuns. Overall, Asian Americans are the number one, by race anyways, unaffiliated, but Black Protestants are the fastest growing. Is that correct?
Yeah, 20% were nuns in 2008, and now it's 35%. So they're just as likely to be nuns now as white people are, which I think is really interesting, because you think of Black culture, I think most people tend to think the church is more a central part of Black culture than it is in white culture. But here's an interesting little kind of caveat about that, about the Black church. Amongst the nuns, if you look like white nuns, 60% nothing in particular, 20/20 atheist agnostic, right? So gets you to 100%. Amongst black people who leave the church, 88% are nothing in particular, and 12% are atheist or agnostic. So when they leave, they don't go as black people do not say they're atheists. Like if you look at the data, they do not take on that atheist agnostic thing, because I think it has a much more of a stigma in black culture compared to white culture. And so therefore, when they leave, they don't go as far as white people do. I think it's a key distinction, which I actually think they're more amenable to coming back because they don't stray as far. Not saying there's going to be some sort of like major revolution in black Americans, but I do think that it's a tell, right, about what words mean in different cultures. They're not all the same.
Right. Well, and as we think about Gen Z, that's an even higher level. That hockey stick starts to, graph starts to really spike when we get to Gen Z. Maybe kind of a broad question. If you were a college pastor in the early 90s versus the mid-aughts versus today, what kind of college student are you looking at? What's the religious landscape on campus?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is now that you got to accept the fact that lots of people are going to come into college as freshmen with really no conception of religion. Yeah. I think for the prior generations, Christianity was the default. And most people at least had gone to church a couple times. They'd been exposed to Christianity, they've been baptized maybe as infants or something like that. If you look at because the GSS asks people what you were the religion in which you were raised, and then asks you what your current religion is. If you look back at people born like the 50s and 60s, 95% of them were born in religious households, right? So they have tons of exposure. And now if you look at the younger cohorts, somewhere between 15 and 20% of them are raised without religion at all. So that's, you're talking a significant number there. But by their 25th birthday, about a third of those people lose religion entirely. So, there's something that happens between like 7 years old and, 17, 18, 19, 20 years old where religion fades away. In the De-Church book, which is the one that's coming out in August, we actually asked people, when in your life were you the most religious? And the plurality was between 0 and 15 years old. Like it wasn't the majority, but it was like 30, 40% of people of like 5 options. They would pick that as their most religious. Even people born like the 50s and 60s would say they were the most religious. Like 40% of them say they were the most religious when they were 0 to 15. So really what happens is in that middle period, like the 15 to 25 or 30, that's where religion starts going away. And I think part of that is the fact that they think that religion is an intellectual pursuit. And again, it's not necessarily an intellectual pursuit. It's a social endeavor with an intellectual pursuit kind of wrapped on top of that. And I think the problem with college is we make everything an intellectual pursuit. It's all about, expanding your mind and learning new things and reading Nietzsche and Marx and Hegel and all those things. But it's also about learning about why people matter and to build interpersonal trust with other people and institutional trust with institutions. And I think that's one thing that I think college students actually learn more from that than they do from the classroom. Like how to navigate bureaucracy, how to deal with a difficult roommate, how to find a summer job. All those little things like that are skills that you're going to use when you go forward in life. And I think religion can be a great way to learn those skills in sort of like a safe, controlled, not wild environment. Here's a statistic for you. Amongst 18 to 22-year-olds, the plurality, the option that's chosen the most on surveys when it comes to religion is nothing in particular. 1 in 3 18 to 20-year-olds today are nothing in particular. So that's what you're looking at. They're not atheist agnostics, by the way. Like 6% are atheists, 7% are agnostics, like 13%. So that's 13%. 33% are nothing in particular, which means they're open. They look at all religion and go, meh. I call it the meh option. The shake your head, shrug your shoulders. I don't really care one way or the other option. And I think that leads to actually a ton of opportunity and possibility for college pastors to take people who are not opposed to religion, but not for it either, and to show them religion in a way that makes sense to them, that could actually help them get through the rest of their lives, not just because of praying and Jesus and things, but also the social aspect of it could help them get through some really dark moments.
We sometimes say around here, that we're connecting people to Jesus and growing their faith, but also just showing them how to human, all like the things you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes you can bring that together. Sometimes it's like, hey, let's just we always do life hacks at the beginning. Hey, let's just talk about credit cards for a second as a freshman. And I've had graduates that have gone off and said, that was the most important thing I learned in college. But bringing those things together, I think, is so incredibly important.
Oh, I teach a senior capstone class, which is about how writing a big final paper for political science. But we spend like 2 weeks talking about money, and careers and jobs and stuff. And I'm like, I think you're actually doing a great thing by doing that, by the way, because it's like you're giving them life skills. You're saying like, there's data that says this. Religion actually teaches you civic skills. So like things like how to run a meeting, how to do a fundraiser, how to organize an event. Where do you learn those skills? In church, right? Like churches teach you how to do basic stuff that you're going to then transfer into the world of work. And then, maybe get a promotion or a raise or a better job because you can say, oh, I helped do a fundraiser for my church. We raised $12,000 and here's how we did it. Blah, blah, blah. Like those skills. And the data actually says the people who are the most likely to benefit from those skills are people at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. So I think religion is like this great leveler. I am the research director for a group called Faith Counts. And basically my job is to tell people that what I just told you, which is religion can do good stuff for you, for your community, and for democracy. Like that religion is a net positive. I think that overall that religion does a lot of good social things for American society that we don't talk about very much, and that's one of them.
That's really, I think as mainline Protestants, anything that deals with money smacks of prosperity gospel to us, so we run away from it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Prosperity gospel, Christian nationalism, those things push us away, and I'm kind of fine with being pushed away from the Christian nationalism. But that prosperity piece, you don't have to preach a prosperity gospel to give money skills to a college student. I think there's something that we can be missing, just these basic life skills, and not just college students, 20, 30-year-olds, need these skills and the socialization you can get through that.
Yeah.
You said 33% are the unaffiliated.
Yep.
I believe in your book, there's also something about the joining, those that join things has gone down dramatically. So your Gen X a college student would have joined something a lot more readily than your Gen Z student.
Yeah, that's Bob Putnam. There's a book called Bowling Alone that came out in like 1993, where he argues that we don't bowl in bowling leagues anymore. We bowl by ourselves. But he traces the collapse of all kinds of social institutions, the American Legion and the Elks and the Moose and just fraternal organizations that just do the Shriners, that just do good stuff for the community. And what's funny is he blames that on cable television because it was like 1993 and cable television was really taking off across America and people now could watch more than 4 channels. They could watch, premium channels. I always think that it should be called tweeting alone or Facebooking alone or Netflixing alone, because everything that Bob Putnam saw in the 1990s, we're seeing like that turbocharged in 2023. And people are not, if you look at membership in all kinds of organizations, there's hardly an organization in America today that's not been decimated the last 30, 40, 50 years by this like collapse of civic volunteerism. The only thing that's really that gone the other direction is travel sports.
Right.
Which is honestly probably bad because travel sports are really only for rich families because travel sports are expensive. And so I think it's like we've taken like all these really good civic organizations that were really sort of more open and cheap and easy to access, and we replaced them with really bad substitutes. And I think we're a lot worse for that. I tell my students all the time, and I think college students need to hear this. You will never be more social in your life than when you're in college. It is so easy to make connections in college. You sit next to someone in class. You sit next to them in the cafeteria. You have a dorm room, with a hallway. And in my college, we all had our dorm rooms open, our hallway doors open almost all the time, unless we were sleeping. And so you just walk down the hallway and find someone to go hang out with. It would be hard to not be social in college. And then we plop you in the real world at 23, 24, and it's hard to be social in your 20s because you got to make plans. And no one wants to make plans. You just want to hang out. And so I think we need to start telling, like, how do you recreate this social experience when you lose all the trappings and infrastructure that college provided for you? Well, religion's one way to do that. Religion can help you rebuild that social network and that safety that you had when you were in college. I think those are the kind of things that students need to hear more about because you don't know what you have. You don't know what you have until it's gone.
Right.
And man, I think a lot of students are in a rude awakening when they turn 25 and go, God, why am I so angry? Why am I so lonely? Why am I so depressed? Because you're not in social groups, and we created a society to make it harder for you to be in social groups. And all you got social media, which is a poor substitute for real life socialization. You got to work to be social now, which sucks.
No, you're right on that. And that is the number one thing I hear from students. How do I make friends? I just presumed these 20 people from my dorms, my dorm they were going to continue to be friends in my 20s and 30s. And they come back. How do we connect? I'm not connected anywhere. I mean, that's such an important point. And with this not connecting piece, I've been trying to track this with my students, because what I hear a lot is, I don't have time for that. I'm busy. And also, I binge watched that thing last night, and I'm hearing them tell the stories. Hey, fine. I'm not against the binge watching, but what it kind of tells me is there's like an allotment of time where you're going to be with people, and it's less now. And so, it's the alone time comes out of the binge watching, but there's like a less amount of time. The busyness comes from there's less time that I can give towards being with people. And so I got to cut things out. So I just have less capacity, maybe. Not sure what's going on there, but I hear that all the time.
Oh, people say, I don't have time for church. What you're saying is, I don't want to prioritize my time towards church.
Right.
Like, let's call it what it is. You're not busy. You chose to be, you chose these we all have the same 24 hours in a day. You choose what you use those 24 hours on, whatever it is. And I think that's when people are like, I just think that students are not fully aware of that my one of the worst, probably the second worst year of my adult life was my first year in grad school. I moved away from the community in which I was born and raised. I was a youth pastor. I quit that job. I went to, I lived in a town called Marion, which is like 20 miles away from Carbondale, which is where I was getting my PhD at. I was a pastor of a small church of all 75-year-old people and older. I knew no one in the community. There were some days I literally talked to no one. And that sucked. Like, that was objectively an awful year basically all I did was read for grad school, watch TV, play video games, and do the pastoring thing. That was not a fun life. And I think a lot of 20-somethings are in that same boat that I was in, and realizing how hard that is. And the only way that we kind of got reconnected with other people was by having kids, right. Especially in small towns. It revolves around family and children. And so getting our kids into school and now getting them into sports and other activities has allowed us to meet other families. And now we have a really nice friend group of like 5 or 6 families with kids that are close to our kids' ages. But man, when that whole my 20s and early 30s, because we didn't have kids, and then pandemic happened, man, that sucked. Like, life sucked for us. And I was married, so I at least had a spouse to kind of, converse with. And I just don't think that we talk about that enough with college students. Is like, wow, so your social life is going to change dramatically over the next 5 to 10 years. And you need to be thinking, and you need to be purposeful about creating a social network for yourself in one way or the other, because it's not going to naturally happen anymore.
Yeah, just like you're searching for a job in your mid-20s, you got to be searching for friends,
yes,
and community, and they're about similar in their importance for your well-being.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. And when it comes to like a job, where do you take a job? Do you take one far away because it's a better job, but you don't know anybody?
5,000 more here, but maybe it's not worth that to maintain your friend group.
Exactly. Yes. And I think those are the kind of questions that the college students don't even know. They don't know what they don't know.
Right.
And I think part of what religion has to do is say, like, let's think about this holistically. And maybe the decision you make is going to be different based on these parameters that you didn't think about before.
No, absolutely. I hope all the campus pastors out there are hearing that. I think that's so critical. And I know we're coming up on time. I just had one more question, and this was a little bit of a survey from some other college pastors. In terms of the spiritually unaffiliated, religiously unaffiliated, are there any graphs or studies on what the spirituality of that group is like? And I say this because we've been, in college ministry the last 5 or 6 years, there's an increase in, psychedelics and tarot and Wicca, but they're not Wiccans. And they're like a mishmash of all kinds of things that's always been there, but it's just been spiking up. Agnostics, you can tell because they talk about the universe and it's kind of a karma. You put out good and you get good. That's what we hear from the agnostics that we know and love here. But this group is very different, and they're kind of dabbling in lots of things. But is there any narrative around spiritual practices of this group that you're aware of?
Well, I would point you to the D Church book that's coming out. Great D Churching was coming out in August. We do talk about that some. It's people who we classify D Church people as people who used to go at least once a month or more and now go less than once a year. Some people who were churched and now are not churched. And that book, actually, we did 3 surveys of those people specifically. So it's actually probably the biggest collection effort ever for those people in that group. I think of it in terms of like that nothing in particular group, the one I was talking about before. Those are the kind of people that are spiritually hungry, but just don't like institutional religion. And you know that because a third of them say religion's at least somewhat important to them. So like they're still like, like they're still thoughtful about those things. I think here's how I approach those kind of folks. I say to them, you have some people don't have any use for religion or use for spirituality. I fully recognize those people. And you know what? That's fine. Not me. If it works for you, that's great. There are people in the middle. And what I would say to them is, why do you have to be so cynical about institutions? Like why are you predisposed? If you look back at the history of religion, not just Christianity, but all religion, it's corporate. It's always been corporate and it's always been collective. And why? Because that's what has worked for, all of recorded history. And I would say to people in that boat, I would say, why do you think you're so different? What has worked for billions of people who lived for thousands of years before you, and you come in and go, nah, I'll take this part, but I don't need that part. I mean, come on. You're not fundamentally different than your grandparents or your great-grandparents or your great-great-grandparents. You're all made of the same stuff. And to think that like you want to throw off these institutions because you're too good for them, I think is an absolute crock of crap, to be honest with you. We are designed to be in institutions. We are designed to be part of something, and you need that part. So when they say, well, I practice yoga, or I do meditation, or blah, 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 I go, you need to do that together. You need the together part. Like that's a crucial part of being a person, a spiritual person is being spiritual together.
I think it kind of can go both ways on that, where I think with students who are saying, oh, I do this spiritual practice, that, rather than just saying, that's scary and demonic and you're going to hell, let's ask questions. Well, why do you do these things? What do you think is going on in these and be curious and investigate. And at the same time, just ask that question that you just asked. Why do you think institutions are just inherently bad? I know different scandals in churches, but like just as itself, why is an institution bad? Even to my colleagues, there's a move to kind of, want to destroy denominations. And I say my reality is I deal with cults every day on campus. I think supervision, me having a bishop, is a good thing in general. And it needs to be appreciated because there's some accountability structure there. This ministry I have, Jacob's Porch, to become a cult like that. It's set up for it, right? Unless we have controls and bishops and episcopal oversight, it actually helps. So
we need adults in the room. There's an article written called "In Defense of Gatekeepers." Like they have such a negative connotation, but God, we need adults to walk in the room and go, "Nope, not going to do that. You got a little bit over your skis there, kid. Let's back up." And that's what I worry about with non-denominational churches. There's no adults in the room. It's all right there. Like there's no oversight. And if you think that sex abuse only happens in institutional religion, you're full of crap because it happens everywhere. Yeah. And these non-denoms, the reason you don't hear about it is because they make sure that you don't hear about it. So at least there's transparency and accountability and not as much as there should be in the Catholic Church and in the Southern Baptist Convention, but at least there's someone who did come in eventually and say, you're wrong. We got to investigate. And I think these non-denoms, the incentive structure they have is the exact opposite of that. It's obfuscate, it's stall, it's to not fully investigate things. And I think that actually is much worse for American society and institutional trust. These non-denoms are.
Right from the mouth of a social scientist, folks. Gatekeepers can be a good thing. So Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. This has been just a wonderful conversation. So much for us to chew on. And where can we find you? Where should we look for you?
I don't know. All over.
Go to his Substack. It's really great if you're on.
Yeah. So I'm on Twitter at Ryan Burge, but my Twitter's basically become like a way to point people to my Substack, which is actually good because Substack actually pays. Graphsaboutreligion.com is my Substack. It'll take you to my, if you do graphsaboutreligion.com, you'll get to me. RyanBurge.net. That's my personal website. Nuns 2nd edition just came out last week. And then I have a book called The Great De-Churching with Michael Graham and Jim Davis, which comes out in August from Zondervan. You can pre-order now on Amazon or wherever you do that kind of thing. Yeah, I think that's you can find on Instagram. I'm Graphs About Religion on Instagram. I post graphs from the Substack on my Instagram, and that's kind of what I do.
And what was the other group? Faith Counts, or what was that?
Yeah, Faith Counts. I'm the research director for Faith Counts, which is a nonprofit interfaith organization where basically my job is to basically tell people that faith is good. Religion, it's okay to be religious in America. There's actually a ton of value to being religious in America. So we have a TikTok account. We have a Facebook group that has 700,000 people on it that shares stuff. I mean, so it's a really great organization that I'm glad to be a part of. It's Faith Counts is what's faithcounts.com is how you get to them. And my part's called Faith Facts because I do all the data stuff. So Faith Facts is a work piece of Faith Counts.
Wonderful. Thank you for all that. And to my colleagues that are serving in churches, in Lutheranism, ELCA churches, definitely going to recommend this D-Church book when it comes out, because you're going to get a profile of mainline D-Church people with evangelicals and Catholics. And who is that person? Why is that person D-Churching of the 40 million or so D-Church in this country? What's the profile of that person, which could be very, good to know. So recommend all these things. And Dr. Burge, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Been a pleasure.